The rain hadn't let up over Baltimore in 3 long days when Naomi Hartley pressed the button for the private elevator one final time, a worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and an old shoebox pressed tight to her chest. No suitcase, no boxes. Nothing that hinted she was walking away from a job she'd poured 3 years of her life into. She kept her gaze lowered the way she always had, her dark hair tied back, her thin shoulders drawn inward like a woman who'd long ago learned to make herself small so no one would study her too closely. High above, behind a wall of glass in a study almost no one was ever allowed to enter, Elliot Vance stood with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched and watched her cross the marble lobby on the security monitor. He was the kind of man others quickly learned not to cross. Dark hair silvering at the temples, a faint scar tracing his jaw, eyes the color of cold water, carrying the stillness of someone who'd never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Not 20 minutes earlier, his head of security had told him something that turned that stillness to ice. His father's antique watch, the one thing in that house money could never replace, had vanished from the safe, and the only person who'd set foot in that room was the quiet woman on the night crew, who never dared meet anyone's eyes. Everything inside him had already ruled her guilty. A woman who wouldn't look you in the eye was a woman with something to hide, and men in his world didn't last long by handing thieves the benefit of the doubt. But there was one thing he couldn't reason away, and it was the reason he set the glass down instead of reaching for his phone. A thief runs. A thief sells what she's taken, disappears, buys a ticket somewhere far and warm. Naomi wasn't running. On the screen she stepped out into the pouring rain without an umbrella, holding that shoebox as though it carried something worth more than the watch ever could. And she turned away from the highway, away from the pawn shops, away from every direction a guilty woman would take, and walked toward the poorest corner of the city. Elliot watched her fade into the dark, and against every rule he'd built his whole life upon, he reached for his keys. He told himself he was going out to catch a thief. He didn't yet know he was about to meet the one person who'd make him question everything he believed about, who deserves to be trusted. And by the time he understood what was really tucked inside that shoebox, it would be far too late to take back a single thing he'd assumed. If stories about second chances and the quiet strength of ordinary people move you, do us a small favor and tap that like button right now. Share this with someone who believes a person is more than the worst thing others assume about them. And subscribe so you won't ever miss a story that lingers with you long after it's over. Now let's head back to that rainy night in Baltimore and find out what Elliot Vance discovered when he quietly followed her into the dark. Elliot's car rolled out through the underground garage gates, with its headlights turned down to their lowest setting, and he kept far enough behind that the small figure ahead couldn't possibly realize she was being followed. Rain slashed diagonally through the streetlights, turning everything into blurred streaks of color, and among those streaks Naomi walked slowly, her head bowed, the shoebox still pressed tightly against her chest as though it were a second heart. He had already imagined the route a thief would take: a hastily hailed taxi, a pawn shop open late, a train station with a departure out of the city, but she turned toward none of those places. She simply kept walking, from one block to the next, beneath a downpour that any ordinary person would have done everything possible to escape, until she stopped at an old bus shelter with a roof riddled with holes. Elliot pulled over on the opposite side of the street, turned off his lights, and watched. She stood there alone, soaked through, neither impatient nor looking over her shoulder even once. He had lived long enough in his world to know that the guilty always looked back. The guilty heard footsteps in every gust of wind, but this woman stood motionless as though she had nothing left to lose, or as though the most precious thing she possessed wasn't kept anywhere another person could steal it. The phone inside the car vibrated, cutting through his thoughts. The screen showed the name of the man in charge of the Eastern Docks. Elliot answered but said nothing first, an old habit that forced the person on the other end to speak before he did. A man's voice came through, hurried and tense, reporting that tonight's shipment had run into trouble at the checkpoint, that someone was demanding a larger share, and that they needed his decision. Elliot looked through the rain toward the bus stop, where Naomi had just adjusted the bag on her shoulder, and answered in a voice no louder than a whisper, yet strong enough to silence the man on the other end. No one was getting a larger share. Anyone who wasn't satisfied could come and tell him in person the next morning. As for the shipment, they were to handle it the way they had always done. He ended the call without waiting for a reply. In Elliot Vance's world, words only needed to be spoken once, and that world had taught him that every person had a price, every act of kindness had a purpose, and every silence concealed some scheme. That was exactly why the woman standing beneath that damaged shelter unsettled him so deeply, because she fit none of the patterns he had ever known. The last bus of the night finally arrived, old and swaying, casting a sickly yellow light across the water-slicked road. Naomi climbed aboard, and Elliot followed behind, close enough not to lose it, far enough away to be nothing more than an anonymous pair of headlights in the night. The bus carried her through neighborhoods he had never had any reason to enter, past rows of houses that grew lower and lower, shops boarded shut with wood, and streetlights where every few poles, one was dark, like broken teeth in a weary mouth. This wasn't the route to the airport, it wasn't the direction of the harbor. There wasn't a single pawnshop still open in this part of the city. The farther they went, the more the anger inside Elliot's chest began to cool, and in its place came a feeling he hated even more than anger: confusion. He had built his entire life upon his ability to read people, to know who was lying before they even opened their mouths, and now every judgment he had made was slipping off the rails, little by little, with each turn of the wheels. If she had taken the watch, where could she be carrying it among these poor streets? If she hadn't taken it, why had she left in the middle of the night, like someone running away? Through the rain-streaked window of the bus, he caught a brief glimpse of her face resting against the frame, her eyes open and staring into nothing, and for one very short moment, beneath that faded yellow light, he realized she didn't wear the expression of someone who had just succeeded in stealing something. She wore the expression of someone who had just lost something. The bus hissed to a stop at a dark corner, near the farthest edge of the city, and Naomi stepped down alone, a small figure beneath the rain that had softened into a fine mist. Elliot parked some distance away, lowered his window, and watched her. She crossed the street and walked toward an old building wedged among the dark houses around it, a faded red brick structure with a sagging porch. But unlike everything else on that street, its windows were glowing, warm golden light spilling into the darkness like the breath of something alive. An old wooden sign hung from the iron gate, though from where he sat he couldn't read the words. Naomi stopped before the gate, and Elliot watched her do something strange. She straightened her back, smoothed her wet hair, wiped her face with her sleeve, then gave a small roll of her shoulders, as though shedding some invisible cloak, as though every burden she had carried throughout the journey had to be left outside that gate. Then she pushed it open and stepped inside. Elliot remained motionless in the car, his fingers tapping slowly against the steering wheel, and a thought rose within him so clearly that it was almost spoken aloud. That whatever this place might be, it was certainly not somewhere a thief should have gone. Elliot waited a little longer before leaving the car, pulling the collar of his coat up, and crossing the wet street with footsteps that made no sound, an old skill from years he no longer wished to remember. The wooden sign on the iron gate slowly came into view beneath the porch light, its hand-painted letters faded and peeling but still legible. The Lighthouse Home, a long-term care and treatment residence for children, and beneath it, in smaller, carefully written words, a place where every child is welcome. Elliot stood frozen before that sign longer than he would ever have admitted. Inside his mind, the pieces he had arranged so neatly, a thief, a valuable object, an escape, suddenly crashed to the ground, and not one of them fit together anymore. A thief didn't bring stolen goods to a children's home at midnight. He moved along the low fence tangled with vines until he found a hidden corner where the darkness beneath an old oak tree covered him completely, and from there he could see straight into the row of brightly lit windows on the ground floor. The old panes cast out light as golden as honey, and through the glass misted with condensation, he saw Naomi enter a large room whose walls were covered with clumsy crayon drawings. Then something happened that made him hold his breath. From the hallway inside, several children in pajamas came rushing out like a flock of sparrows startled from their nest, some running, some skipping, some stretching both arms toward her from across the room, and all of them swarmed around the rain-soaked woman in excited chatter, as though she were the greatest holiday of their entire year. A little boy with curly hair clung to her leg and refused to let go. A girl with her hair tied into two pigtails leaped straight into Naomi's open arms, and Naomi lifted her high, spinning once in the middle of the room even though her clothes were still dripping wet. And then Elliot saw it, the one thing he had never seen in all 3 years she had worked beneath his roof, Naomi Hartley's smile. It wasn't the submissive bow of her head, nor the quiet way she made herself small in the corners of hallways, but a smile that opened fully and lit her entire face. The kind of smile that transformed the nearly invisible woman from the night shift into someone completely different, someone real, radiant, and so alive that Elliot suddenly understood the version of her he had always seen at the estate was only a shadow, and this was who she truly was. She knelt until she was level with the children, and said something that sent the whole group into helpless laughter. Then an elderly woman with silver hair and a thick cardigan stepped out from the kitchen, wiped her hands on her apron, and embraced Naomi with the kind of hug shared by people who had known one another for a very long time. Elliot stood outside in the darkness, mist collecting on the shoulders of his coat, and for the first time in years, he felt as though he were the one standing in the wrong place, an outsider staring through the window of a world his money had never been able to buy him entry into. He had come to expose a thief, yet what he had found was an aging house filled with children's laughter in the poorest neighborhood in the city, and the woman he had already condemned in his mind was being welcomed by those children, as though the person they loved most had finally come home. Just then, a faint movement at the edge of his vision drew his attention away from the window. At the far end of the street, where the streetlights had gone dark long ago, a dark-colored car sat motionless beside the curb, a car he was certain hadn't been there when he arrived. Its windows were black, its lights were off, and there was no sound from the engine. But through the fine rain, Elliot saw a tiny glow flash and disappear behind the glass, like the light of a phone screen or the tip of a cigarette. And in that brief instant he clearly sensed a still figure seated behind the wheel. The shadow's gaze wasn't directed at him. It was fixed on the glowing window where Naomi stood among the children. Elliot's instincts stirred, the instincts that had saved his life more times than all his bodyguards combined. But at the very moment he tried to look more closely, the curly-haired boy inside suddenly tugged Naomi toward the hallway, the rest of the children following in a noisy little crowd, and she allowed them to pull her toward a small room at the end of the corridor, where the gentle orange glow of a nightlight spilled through the doorway. She held the shoebox in both hands, carefully, the way someone would carry something fragile, and vanished from his sight as she stepped through the door. Elliot followed along the fence, searching for a new angle, every thought of the dark car temporarily swept from his mind by a larger question tightening around him. Who was she bringing that box to? He had no idea that the answer waiting beyond that doorway would leave him stunned, and he had no idea of something else either, that in the wet darkness of this poor street, he wasn't the only person watching Naomi Hartley. Elliot found a new vantage point along the side of the building, where a low window looked directly into the small room, glowing with an orange nightlight, and he pressed himself behind the trunk of the oak tree, only a few steps from the glass, close enough to see everything inside clearly, and catch fragments of sound slipping through the narrow gap in the window. The room was small but strangely warm, its walls painted sky blue and covered with silver paper stars, a wooden shelf filled with picture books whose spines had been worn soft, and on the single bed made up with spaceship sheets, a young boy of elementary school age sat propped against his pillows, his brown hair tousled, his face lighting up as though the whole world had just been handed to him when Naomi stepped through the doorway. The boy threw both arms into the air and cried her name, "Sister Naomi, Sister Naomi. I knew it was you. I heard the gate and knew right away." And Naomi raised one finger to her lips to gently quiet him, her eyes sparkling with laughter, then sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed his messy hair with a tenderness that made Elliot hold his breath outside the window. "Hush now, Eli. Everyone else is asleep," she said, her voice as soft as the wind, and the boy immediately covered his mouth with both small hands, though his eyes were still laughing louder than any shout. Then Naomi placed the shoebox on the bedspread, the box she had clutched throughout the rain-soaked journey like a treasure, the box Elliot had been certain contained his father's antique watch, and lifted the lid. Elliot fixed his eyes on every inch of that moment, every muscle in his body tightening, as he waited for the familiar gleam of metal beneath the light, but what appeared inside the box left him frozen where he stood. A red toy car with chipped paint, carefully cleaned until it shone, a thin comic book that still carried the scent of new paper, a small hand-knitted scarf that wasn't yet finished, with 2 knitting needles still tucked into the ball of yarn, several colorful packets of candy, and at the very bottom, arranged neatly like precious letters, was a small stack of handwritten papers, each bearing the name of a child, along with carefully formed lines that he couldn't read from where he stood, though their purpose was unmistakable. They were the notes of someone quietly worrying about each child, one by one. There was no watch. There was nothing in that box worth even the price of a dinner in the world Elliot lived in, and yet this woman had carried it through 3 rain-flooded blocks and protected it more carefully than she had protected herself. The boy named Eli immediately snatched up the red car, held it at eye level, and turned it from side to side like a true collector, then whispered with reverence that it was more beautiful than every car he had ever owned put together. Naomi laughed softly, tapped him lightly on the forehead, and told him that meant he had to promise to share it with the others. The boy nodded rapidly, then suddenly remembered something terribly important. He leaned forward, pulled a sheet of paper folded into quarters from beneath his pillow, and presented it to Naomi with both hands, wearing the solemn expression of an ambassador delivering official papers. "I drew this for you. It took me several days to finish." Naomi unfolded the paper, and through the glass, Elliot saw her shoulders go still for a beat. On the page was a crayon drawing of a brown-haired woman, wearing a flowing red cape, standing on the roof of a house with her hands on her hips like a superhero, surrounded by tiny children waving up at her, and above them were the most endearingly crooked words, "Our superhero sister." Eli rested his chin in his hands and chattered in the voice of a child who believed completely in every plan he made. "Dr. Han says I'm getting stronger every day, so when I'm all better, I'll take you to the ocean. I've never seen the real ocean, but in the books it's huge, bigger than the whole yard outside the gate. We'll build the biggest sandcastle ever. Promise me." Naomi fell silent for a second whose weight Elliot could feel even through the glass. Then she held out her little finger, and the boy's tiny finger hooked around hers, their heads leaning close together as a promise was sealed, in the most sacred way childhood had ever invented. "I promise," she said, and Eli broke into a satisfied grin, hugging the red car against his chest while Naomi pulled the blanket up beneath his chin. Outside in the darkness, Elliot Vance stood motionless beneath the oak tree, the fine rain soaking cold through his expensive coat, though he could no longer feel it. The man who had built an entire empire on the principle of never trusting anyone now stood in the poorest neighborhood in the city, staring through a window at a shoebox filled with old toys and scraps of paper bearing children's names, and felt the foundations of every judgment he had made begin to crack, one line at a time. He had followed a thief across half the city through a rainy night, and what he had caught her doing was sealing a promise with a hooked little finger about a sandcastle. The icy anger he had carried away from the estate had vanished somewhere along the road, replaced by a question far colder, a question that began to trickle down his spine like rainwater slipping beneath his collar, because his father's watch was still missing. The safe had still been opened by someone's hand, and if the woman sitting beyond that window, softly singing a lullaby, wasn't the one who had taken it, then who was? Elliot returned to the estate when dawn was already near, but he didn't sleep. He sat in his study with the glass of whiskey from the night before still untouched, watching the rain fade beyond the window, while inside his mind the image of the open shoebox played again and again, like a strip of film that refused to stop. When the first light of day reached the stone floor, he lifted the internal phone and spoke exactly one sentence. "Ask Mrs. Doyle to come see me." Margie Doyle had been the housekeeper of this mansion since before Elliot bought it, a silver-haired woman who wore her hair in a neat bun, kept her back straight, and always held her hands clasped together in front of her apron. She was also one of the very few people in the house who dared to look him directly in the eyes when she spoke. She entered the study with her usual composure, but Elliot noticed at once that her eyes were already red, and that the hands folded before her were gripping each other more tightly than usual. He didn't waste time. "Tell me about Naomi Hartley," he said. "Everything you know." Margie remained silent for a moment, as though weighing whether the man before her wanted the truth, or merely the version most convenient for him. And then she chose the truth. She chose it in the way people do when they've grown too old to be afraid. "You want to hear about that girl, very well, but you'll have to hear all of it," she said, and her voice trembled from the very first sentence. "She worked here for 3 years, Mr. Vance, and in all those 3 years, she never once took home a full month's wages." Elliot frowned slightly, and Margie continued before he could ask. No one was cheating her out of it. She asked for it herself. During her very first week, she went to the accounting office and arranged for part of her pay to be transferred directly, every month, to a children's home on the edge of the city. She said that if the money passed through her hands, she was afraid there might come a month when things became so difficult that she would keep it, so it was better not to let her have it at all. Mrs. Doyle shook her head, her gaze dropping to her own hands. "Do you understand what that means? A girl who wore the same pair of shoes, with worn-through soles for 2 winters. A girl I had to pretend I'd made too much soup every evening just to force her to eat a little more. And that same girl was afraid she might keep her own money for herself." Elliot stood motionless by the window, and an image came unbidden into his mind of the men under his command. Men who wore watches heavier than their guns, of meetings where each one tried to demand a larger share, more territory, another car, of an entire world built upon a hunger that could never be filled. And in the middle of that world beneath his own roof, there had been a woman who, for 3 years, had feared nothing more than accidentally keeping money that belonged to her. "What else do you know?" he asked, his voice lower than he had intended. Margie told him slowly, as though turning the pages of a book she had long since memorized, that Naomi worked the night shift but had never once been late, that she knew the name and dietary needs of every member of the household staff, that on holidays, she was the only person who remembered to buy a gift for the elderly gardener who was hard of hearing, and whom everyone else in the mansion seemed to have forgotten existed, that once Margie had found her sitting at 4 o'clock in the morning, mending the frayed hem of the curtains in the sitting room, even though no one had asked her to, simply because she said it would be a shame to let such beautiful curtains wear out. Then Margie raised her eyes and looked directly at Elliot, and what she said next was no longer an account but an accusation, open and undisguised. "And yet this morning, the entire house is whispering that she's a thief, Mr. Vance. They're saying she took your father's watch. They're saying the cameras recorded her as the last person to enter the room." A dry laugh escaped her, almost bitter with anger. That girl once found a coin beneath the sofa and placed it on a tray in the kitchen, with a note explaining where she had found it. So what reason would she have to open your safe? Elliot didn't answer. He had learned long ago that silence uncovered more than interrogation ever could, and sure enough, something flickered across Margie's face within that silence. A brief disturbance that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. She opened her mouth as though about to say something more, something buried deeper beneath the story, her fingers digging into one another, her eyes darting quickly toward the closed door, as though she feared it might have ears, but then she pressed her lips together and swallowed whatever she had meant to say. When she spoke again, her voice had become flat. "That's all I know, Mr. Vance. I'm an old woman. I only hope you won't be too quick to believe what someone has carefully prepared for you to believe." Her words remained in the room long after Mrs. Doyle had left. Elliot stood alone in the study, now flooded with the light of morning, slowly turning the untouched glass of whiskey in his hand, while the instinct that had kept him alive through all those years began to speak. It was no longer the faint disturbance he had felt the night before, but something as clear as a knock against the window. A woman who couldn't bring herself to keep her own wages wouldn't open another person's safe. A real thief wouldn't travel toward the poorest neighborhood in the city, carrying a box of children's toys. The cameras said one thing, while 3 years of her life said another, and in Elliot Vance's world, when evidence and human character contradicted each other this completely, there was only one possible explanation. Someone had arranged everything so that he would see exactly what they wanted him to see. Something about this case didn't fit, and he was going to find out what it was. In the days that followed, Elliot Vance's estate continued to operate as though nothing had happened. The black cars still came and went on schedule, and meetings still took place behind heavy wooden doors, but beneath that smooth and undisturbed surface, a quiet investigation had begun to move, secretive and patient, much like the man who commanded it. Elliot didn't entrust the matter to the estate's security team, the same team that had handed him the footage condemning Naomi. Instead, he called in an old associate, a thin man named Pruitt, who made his living uncovering the things other people wanted buried, a man whose only loyalty in the world belonged to Elliot's money, and who had never failed him in all their years together. The first thing Elliot asked him to investigate had nothing to do with the watch. It was the dark-colored car parked beneath the dead streetlight at the end of the road that night, the motionless shadow behind the wheel that Elliot had briefly noticed and then allowed to slip from his mind, because his instincts kept returning to that detail and knocking against it like a fist against a closed door. Pruitt didn't need much time. A security camera outside a pawn shop 2 blocks away had recorded the car passing twice that night, and its license plate, after being traced through several layers of borrowed registrations and complicated rental records, led back to a name that left Elliot sitting motionless in his study for a very long time while the coffee before him slowly went cold. The car had been assigned to a man named Merrick, and Merrick worked for Sasha Kroll. Sasha Kroll, Elliot's right-hand man, the one who stood beside him during every private meeting, the man who held the keys to half the organization's secrets, the same man who had stood in this very room only the week before, with a face as cold as stone, and said, in a voice filled with regret, that it was always tragic when someone inside the household turned around and bit the hand that fed them, referring to Naomi. Elliot didn't rush to judgment, he never rushed, but he began laying the pieces beside one another and studying them for a long time. If Naomi was merely a servant who had stolen something, why would one of Sasha's men sit in the rain all night in the poorest district of the city simply to watch her? Men weren't assigned to guard against a petty thief who had already fled. They were assigned to watch a threat. They were assigned to watch a witness. The word rose by itself inside Elliot's mind and refused to leave. Witness. There was only one reason someone would send a man to follow a penniless woman as she walked away into the night, to make certain she remained silent, to make certain she truly went far away, and never turned back to tell anyone what she had seen. So what had Naomi Hartley seen? Elliot ordered more records brought to him, the duty schedules of everyone who had worked at the estate during the previous week, the entry logs for the area surrounding his study, and a list of every person who knew the access code to the private corridor. While he waited for those documents to be placed on his desk, he opened the safe in his study, the safe that now held an empty space on its upper shelf where the leather case containing his father's watch had rested for so many years. He stood staring at that empty space, and an old memory surfaced without warning, strangely sharp and complete. He remembered the rare evenings of his childhood when his father had still been there, that quiet man sitting at the table, removing the watch from his wrist and turning it over beneath the lamplight, his thumb slowly brushing across the back again and again as though it were a habit or a prayer spoken without words. Once, when Elliot was a boy, he had picked up the watch and noticed that its back wasn't smooth like those of other watches. It was covered with a dense row of tiny symbols, not letters, not ordinary numbers, but lines and circles arranged in some deliberate order. The boy Elliot had asked what they meant, and his father had only smiled, stroked his hair, and told him it was a matter for adults, but that one day he would understand. That day had never come. His father had died suddenly, and the watch had passed into Elliot's possession, along with the symbols that had never been explained. For years he had kept it inside the safe, as though he were preserving a piece of the man himself, never once considering that those tiny markings might be anything more than a private decoration belonging to someone who was gone. But tonight, standing before the empty shelf with Sasha Kroll's name, written on Pruitt's report, that belief cracked for the first time, opening in a different direction that sent a cold sensation across the back of his neck. Someone inside this house had opened the safe, while it was filled with cash and documents worth many times more, yet the only thing missing was the old watch of a dead man. No one stealing for money would have chosen that way. Elliot closed the safe, turned the lock, and stood for a long time in the darkness of the room, hearing his own instincts speak with every beat like approaching footsteps. He had misunderstood the case from the very beginning. His mistake hadn't been only in whom he suspected, but in what he believed the motive to be, because the farther he followed these thin and nearly invisible threads, the more it seemed that the theft inside his estate had never truly been about the watch, but about whatever had been engraved on its back. But instinct wasn't evidence, and Elliot Vance had never allowed himself to act on a feeling alone, even when that feeling kept knocking against his chest night after night. Two voices were struggling inside him now. One pointed toward Sasha, toward the dark-colored car and the row of symbols engraved on the back of the watch. The other coldly reminded him that the footage still existed, that the last person to enter that room had still been her, that perhaps everything he had seen at the children's home was nothing more than a carefully staged performance, because he had watched people act even more convincingly than that to take far more from others. And Elliot chose the same path he had always chosen throughout his life whenever two voices contradicted each other. He went in search of a direct answer, using pressure, because experience had taught him that people revealed their true nature most quickly when they were backed into a corner. His men didn't have to search for long. Elliot himself gave them the address, the red brick building with the wooden sign reading the lighthouse home at the edge of the city, the place whose fence he had stood outside throughout an entire rainy night. Sure enough, early that afternoon they reported back. She was there. She came every day. She was helping clean the backyard. When two black cars pulled to a sudden stop outside the gates and Elliot stepped out, the small courtyard that had been filled with the lively sounds of children fell completely silent. Naomi stood in the middle of the yard, still holding a bamboo broom, her hair tied back in haste, and the moment she saw him, she didn't run, didn't turn pale. Only her narrow shoulders sank a little farther, as though she'd expected this for a long time, and now it had finally arrived. Nothing more. The elderly woman in the cardigan who managed the home hurried the children inside, but several small faces remained pressed against the window panes, and there, in the middle of that courtyard, beneath those watching eyes, Elliot did the one thing he would later have given almost anything to take back. He stopped several steps away from her and, in the same voice that had made hardened men break into a cold sweat, asked without preamble where the watch from the safe in his study was. Naomi looked up at him for a moment, then lowered her eyes. "Sir, I didn't take it, that was all. No trembling, no desperate vows, no tears, and it was that very calmness that poured fuel over the suspicious part of Elliot's mind." He stepped closer, lowering his voice into something cold and far more frightening than a shout. "You were the last person inside that room. The cameras recorded you. You left my house in the middle of the night without saying a word, and now you're telling me you didn't take it. So tell me what I'm supposed to believe." He heard his own voice echo across the silent courtyard, sharp and merciless. "You needed money, didn't you? Everyone knows you needed money. This place needs money. The boy inside needs money. A watch like that could support this entire home for several years. Tell me which part of that is wrong." The bamboo broom trembled faintly in Naomi's hands, and her knuckles turned white from the force of her grip. For 1 second, Elliot waited for her to break, waited for her to cry out in protest or collapse into a confession, one of the two reactions every person he had ever pressured eventually surrendered to. But Naomi did neither. Slowly she raised her head, and for the first time in 3 years, the woman who had never dared to look anyone directly in the eyes looked straight into Elliot Vance's. There was no anger in those gray eyes, no resentment, not even tears. There was only an exhaustion so deep it resembled the bottom of a dry well, the weariness of someone who had been doubted too many times in her life, and no longer had the strength to defend herself. And within that exhaustion, something that looked almost like compassion left Elliot frozen where he stood, as though of the two people standing in that courtyard, she was the one who pitied him. "What you choose to believe is your right, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice quiet but unbroken. "I worked in your house for 3 years, and you never once asked my name, so I don't blame you for not believing me today. I only ask one thing. Whatever you have against me, bring it to me. Don't bring it here. The children inside have nothing to do with any of this." Then she lowered her head, not with the frightened submission she had shown so often before, but as though she were closing the conversation, and turned away. Carrying the bamboo broom, she walked back toward the corner of the courtyard and resumed sweeping the wet leaves she had left unfinished, abandoning the most powerful man in the city where he stood, suddenly unsure what to do with his own hands. Elliot remained there longer than a man like him was ever supposed to remain, listening to the steady rustle of the bamboo broom against the paving stones. Watching that slender, patient back, and feeling something inside his chest crack without a sound. All his life, people had either knelt before him or hated him. No one had ever looked at him the way she had, with eyes that forgave him before he even understood he had done something wrong. He returned to the car, closed the door, and signaled for the driver to leave, and throughout the journey home, that image refused to release him. Not the security footage, not the empty safe. The weary eyes that had held no accusation in the middle of a courtyard covered with wet leaves. That night, for the first time in many years, Elliot Vance couldn't sleep. The next morning, with eyes that hadn't closed once, and Naomi's gaze still lodged deep inside his chest, Elliot summoned Pruitt and gave him a single order. I want the original recording from that night, not the version stored on the estate's server, but the one that has never passed through the hands of anyone in this house. And I don't care where you have to dig to find it. Pruitt narrowed his eyes and asked only one question. You think someone cleaned the system inside your own house? Elliot answered with the very thought that had kept him awake all night. The estate's security system recorded simultaneously to 2 locations, the server inside the house and a backup storage cluster housed in the office complex near the docks. Almost no one remembered that the backup cluster even existed. Elliot himself had nearly forgotten it because it had been installed in the earliest days, born from the caution of a man who didn't trust even his own shadow, and most importantly, access to it wasn't controlled by the estate's security team. 3 days later, Pruitt returned carrying a laptop and wearing the expression of a man who had just uncovered something more dangerous than money. He placed the computer on the desk, connected a hard drive, and said simply, "Watch this, and you'll understand why the version inside the house was only that long." Elliot sat down, and beneath the pale blue glow of the screen, that fateful night unfolded before him again, this time in full, without a single cut. He watched Naomi push her cleaning cart into the corridor, at the same time she did every night. He watched her dust the bookshelves, pick up a pen that had fallen beneath the desk, and place it neatly back on the tray, then leave and close the door gently behind her. The entire visit lasted less than 15 minutes, and during those 15 minutes, she never once went near the painting that concealed the safe. That was the footage the security team had shown him, and that was where it had ended. But the original recording didn't end there. It continued. The corridor remained empty beneath the dim night lights. A long stretch of time passed without movement, and then, at the corner of the screen, a figure stepped into view. He wasn't pushing a cleaning cart. He wasn't wearing a uniform. Elliot recognized the walk before the man's face even entered the light, the slight tilt of the left shoulder he had seen beside him for so many years, through so many meetings and behind so many closed doors. Sasha Kroll. Elliot didn't realize he had stopped breathing until pain tightened across his chest. On the screen, Sasha walked directly to the painting and removed it with the practiced movements of a man who had rehearsed the act 100 times in his mind. Without a second of hesitation, he entered the safe code, the code that, other than Elliot, perhaps only the wind itself should have known, and opened the steel door. Then he did the one thing that destroyed every remaining theory of an ordinary theft. He didn't touch the stacked bundles of cash. He didn't touch the envelopes containing documents worth a fortune. His hand went straight to the old leather case on the top shelf. He lifted out the watch, and instead of slipping it into his pocket and leaving like a thief, he remained where he was, turned the back of the watch toward his eyes, took out his phone, switched on its light, and began taking photographs. One angle, then another. He tilted it and photographed it again, capturing close views of the symbols engraved across the back with the precision of a man copying a document, not stealing a piece of jewelry. When he was finished, he slipped the watch into the inside pocket of his coat, closed the safe, and rehung the painting perfectly straight. Before leaving the frame, he raised his face and looked directly into the camera for 1 second. Only 1 second. There was no panic in his eyes. He looked calm, almost defiant, with the gaze of a man who knew with certainty that this footage would never reach the person who needed to see it, because he was the one who controlled the entire estate's security system. He would be the man who cut and reshaped that night into a story containing only the cleaning woman and the room where a safe had been opened. Elliot leaned back in his chair, and the anger came to him not with the noise others might have expected, but coldly and slowly, like water seeping into stone, because his mind now held more than betrayal. A much darker question was beginning to assemble itself from every scattered piece. Sasha hadn't taken the money. He had photographed the symbols. That meant what he needed wasn't the watch, but whatever had been engraved on its back, the series of lines and circles his father had brushed his thumb across during those final evenings of his life. The thing he had said Elliot would understand one day. Sasha Kroll had stood beside him, long enough to hear fragments of the old stories, long enough to know what was kept inside the safe, and if he had been willing to risk everything to copy those symbols, then they weren't the private decoration of a father. They were a key leading to something buried deep in the Vance family's past. Something large enough to make a man who stood beneath only one person and above thousands gamble away his entire position. Something powerful enough to overthrow Elliot from the very chair in which he sat. He replayed the footage once more, stopping on the frame where Sasha looked up at the camera, and as Elliot stared into those calm eyes, one final piece quietly fell into place, sending an icy chill along his spine. The timestamp in the corner of the screen. Naomi had left the estate later than usual that night. The duty log showed it clearly, and the time Sasha had stood before the open safe matched exactly the period when she should still have been cleaning the adjoining corridor. Had she followed her usual route out, she would have passed the end of that hallway, right beside the corner, with an unobstructed view of the painting and the steel door behind it. Elliot stared at the screen, and a question struck through the darkness of the room like a match being lit. What had Naomi Hartley seen that night? While Elliot was tracing the truth through those frames of footage, on the far side of the city, Naomi Hartley was living out her temporary days in a small room, rented by the week above a laundromat. During the day, she went to the lighthouse home to help clean and sit beside Eli until the boy fell asleep. At night, she returned to the room whose only window looked out onto a brick wall, and not one of the people she greeted each day knew that the quiet woman before them was carrying a secret heavy enough to break an entire life. Elliot didn't go to see her, not yet. After what he had done in that courtyard covered with wet leaves, he no longer had the right to arrive empty-handed. He needed the whole truth first, and he gave Pruitt the remaining task. Find me everything about Naomi Hartley's life, not to accuse her, but to understand her, and find out why a witness who saw my safe being opened chose to remain silent, accept the blame, and walk away. The papers Pruitt brought back afterward revealed a life that made even a man who earned his living digging up secrets lower his voice as he delivered the report. She was a child raised among temporary homes, with no parents and no relatives. The only faint light in the records was a woman named Ruth, who had taken Naomi in throughout her adolescence and had died about a year earlier. After Ruth's death, Naomi had become the only support of a boy who shared no blood with her, a child receiving long-term care at the lighthouse home, a boy named Eli. Then Pruitt placed the final document on the desk and lowered his voice. This is what you need to see most, Mr. Vance, and it's also what I advise you to read with the eyes of a human being, before you read it with the eyes of an employer. It was Eli's application for long-term care assistance, the paperwork that determined whether the boy would be allowed to remain at the lighthouse home and receive the proper care he needed, and within that application was one false statement. In the section concerning relationship and guardianship conditions, Naomi had declared herself Eli's legal guardian with a stable residence, while the truth was that the guardianship process after Ruth's death had never been completed. It required time, money, and a permanent home address, 3 things a woman working night shifts and living in a rented room couldn't possess all at once. Had she written the truth, Eli's application would have been set aside, his assistance would have been frozen, and the boy would have been thrown into the machinery of faceless procedures that Naomi's own childhood had taught her could crush a child. She had stood before 2 roads. On one side was an honest declaration that would cast the boy she had promised to protect into uncertainty. On the other were a few untrue lines that would give him a home, meals, gentle nurses, and a room covered with silver paper stars, and she had chosen. She had chosen the smaller wrong to preserve the greater promise, then lived beside it every day, as though she were living beside a buried mine. By the time Elliot lowered the paper, every remaining piece had fitted together inside his mind with merciless precision. Sasha Kroll controlled the vetting of every employee at the estate. Every person who worked in the house had passed through his hands, which meant he had held this file long ago, had seen that weakness long ago, and had stored it away like a knife, waiting for the right day to be used. That day had been the night the safe was opened. Elliot could now see the entire night clearly, without anyone needing to tell him, as though he had been standing at the corner of the corridor himself. Naomi had finished later than usual. She had passed the turn in the hallway. She had seen the steel door standing open and the familiar back of the second most powerful man in the estate. Before she could retreat, he had seen her. A man like Sasha didn't need a knife or a gun to deal with a witness like that. He only needed to step closer and calmly speak Eli's name, mention the application, remind her that a single anonymous call would make the boy lose his place at the lighthouse home, and make her lose even the right to stand beside him. Then he gave her a choice. Remain silent and disappear, or speak and lose everything. People believed the strong man was the one holding the gun, but that night Sasha had held something more powerful than a gun. He held a promise entrusted by the dying to the one left behind, and Naomi had done the only thing a woman like her could do. She hadn't bargained. She hadn't begged. She had quietly packed her things into a shoebox, walked out into the rainy night, and carried the false accusation like a burning coal pressed against her chest. She had willingly become a thief in the eyes of the entire estate, in the eyes of the very man she had served for 3 years, so that no investigating gaze would ever have reason to turn toward the application, toward the room covered with silver paper stars, toward the peaceful sleep of a little boy, counting the days until he was strong enough to see the ocean. Elliot sat motionless in his study for a very long time, with a thin stack of papers before him containing the weight of an entire life. And suddenly he understood something that tightened his throat. On the day he had stood in that brick courtyard and questioned her in the voice he reserved for criminals, she had already possessed the one truth that could have cleared her name with a single sentence. Yet she had looked into his eyes, exhausted and without resentment, and swallowed that sentence, because the price of proving her innocence was a child's future. That woman had sacrificed more than anyone in his world could ever have imagined. That afternoon, after Elliot Vance and the 2 black cars had driven away from the gates of the lighthouse home, Naomi still finished sweeping the courtyard covered with wet leaves, still helped the elderly woman in the cardigan prepare dinner for the children, still sat beside Eli's bed and read him a chapter from a story about a baby whale that had lost its mother, and only after the boy had fallen deeply asleep with the red toy car resting neatly in his palm, did she put on her coat, say goodnight to the older woman, and walk back to the rented room above the laundromat. She climbed the narrow wooden staircase one step at a time, opened the door with its peeling paint, closed it behind her, turned the lock, and then, in the dim darkness filtering in from the street lamp beyond the window that faced a brick wall, Naomi Hartley's legs could no longer carry her another step. She slid slowly down the door to the floor without making a sound, like a coat slipping from a hook, and remained there on the cold wooden boards, with her knees drawn tightly against her chest, the cloth bag still hanging from her shoulder, because she had forgotten even to take it off. All afternoon, she had stood straight. When the black cars had sharply outside the gate, she had stood straight. When that man had questioned her in the voice people reserved for criminals, in front of the elderly woman, in front of the small faces pressed against the window panes, she had stood straight. When he had said she needed money, said the boy inside needed money, said a watch like that could support the whole home for years, every word had fallen like a stone, and still she had stood straight, because she knew that if she trembled, if she cried, the children behind the glass would become frightened, and no child at the lighthouse home was ever allowed to see their sister Naomi break. But here, in a room rented by the week with no one present except her and the silent brick wall outside the window, there was no one left who needed her to stand straight. And so the weight she had carried since that rainy night, through every long day and across the courtyard covered with leaves, finally came crashing down. The tears arrived without warning, without sobs, simply spilling over and running along her cheeks, as though they had been waiting in line behind this door for a very long time. And Naomi wrapped her arms around her knees, buried her face, and cried in the way people cry when they have forgotten what it feels like to make a sound. She wasn't crying because she had been called a thief. Life had called her worse things than that, the girl no one wanted. the unwanted guest, the one with no mother and no father. Each name another temporary house she had once passed through, and she had believed herself hardened long ago. She cried because of something smaller, and therefore more painful, because 3 years of cleaning every stair, remembering every person's dietary restrictions, mending the hem of a curtain at 4 o'clock in the morning simply because she couldn't bear to see something beautiful wear out, had still not earned her even 1 second of hesitation in another person's eyes before they believed she was a thief. It turned out that for people like her, kindness was never allowed to accumulate. One accusation was enough to reduce everything to nothing. In the darkness, her hand moved unconsciously inside the cloth bag and closed around a small object, an old ash-gray button from one of Ruth's cardigans, the only piece Naomi had kept after everything was gone, and she held it tightly in her palm as though she were holding someone else's hand, whispering words in her mind that never reached her lips. "I'm sorry, I tried so hard. I don't know how much longer I can keep trying." For one moment, only one, the thought of giving up passed through her like a cold draft slipping beneath the door. What if she could simply lie down and never have to rise again, never have to stand straight again, never have to carry that burning coal for one more day? But then, through the blur of tears, an image rose before her, clearer than all her sorrow, a tiny little finger hooked around hers, 2 heads leaning close together beneath the orange glow of a nightlight. "Promise me. The ocean is huge, bigger than the whole yard outside the gate. We'll build the biggest sandcastle ever." A promise sealed in the most sacred way childhood had ever invented. And a person might break a promise to the whole world, but no one was allowed to break one made with a little finger like that. Naomi remained in the darkness a while longer, letting the tears finish what they had come to do, then drew in one long, deep, trembling breath, the breath of someone lifting the burden back onto her shoulders. She wiped her face with her sleeve, the same gesture she had made outside the gates of the lighthouse home on that rainy night, stood up, removed the cloth bag, placed the old button on the windowsill, where it could watch over her, and switched on the frail desk lamp. Weak golden light spread through the room, and the woman who had nearly broken in two sat down on the edge of the bed, took the ball of yarn and 2 knitting needles from her bag, and continued working on the small unfinished scarf from the shoebox, one stitch after another, steady and patient, because the cold season was coming, and children's throats needed to be kept warm. Tomorrow she would return to the lighthouse home. She would smile again. She would stand straight again. She had no idea that on the other side of the city, in a room overlooking all of Baltimore, a man was sitting awake through the night with the file of her life spread open across his desk, and that the past she had buried most deeply was about to be uncovered, 1 page at a time. The ash-gray cardigan button rested on the windowsill, and that night, after Naomi knitted the final stitches and drifted to sleep beneath the weak yellow light of the desk lamp, memory carried her back to the night she had never fully told anyone about, the night nearly a year earlier, Ruth's final night. By then, Ruth had grown much weaker. The woman who had once stood as straight as a poplar tree now seemed almost swallowed by the armchair beside the window, but her eyes were still the same. Still the eyes that had seen a teenage Naomi, standing soaked through on her porch during a thunderstorm. A girl who had been sent away from yet another temporary home. And instead of asking for documents like every other adult had done, Ruth had simply opened the door wider and spoken the words Naomi would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Come in, child. The soup is still warm." Ruth's home had never been prosperous. She had only her sewing work and a small garden, but that door had never learned how to close against anyone in need. Naomi grew up in that house and became accustomed to finding a stranger at the dinner table from time to time, a young mother standing in the rain with a baby in her arms, whom Ruth had called inside, an elderly traveler stranded on the road, whom she had pressed a loaf of bread into the hands of, faces that came and went, whose names she could never remember in full. Whenever Naomi asked why she kept giving so much away, Ruth would only smile as she threaded her needle beneath the lamplight and say that kindness was like a seed carried by the wind. We don't need to know where it lands. We only need to know that somewhere the earth will remember. Then came the time when Ruth herself needed care, and it became Naomi's turn to learn how to thread a needle, how to make soup, and how to borrow from one place to cover another as the prescriptions grew thicker with every passing month. That same year, Ruth brought Eli home, the only blood relative left in the family, a little bundle of a boy who was always smiling and whose mother could no longer raise him. Ruth took him in just as she had once taken Naomi in, and the small house suddenly held 3 people who shared no blood, yet had become a family. That final night began like every other. Naomi put on her coat and left for a shift at a packaging factory on the edge of town, a job that paid by the night and dismissed workers without mercy. Anyone who left in the middle of a shift didn't need to return the next morning, and Ruth's new prescription was still waiting at the pharmacy, because there wasn't enough money to collect it. Before leaving, Naomi stopped to straighten Ruth's blanket. Ruth held her wrist longer than usual, so long that Naomi would only understand it later, and whispered, "Be careful, my daughter, I'll be fine. The little one is lying beside me." Eli was curled asleep near the edge of Ruth's bed like a kitten. Sometime after midnight, amid the pounding of the conveyor belts, Naomi felt the phone in her apron pocket vibrate for a long time, then fall silent. She stole a glance downward. The screen showed a missed call from home, and her heart tightened. But at that exact moment, the foreman walked past, sweeping his gaze along the line of workers. At that factory, taking out a phone during a shift was enough reason to be fired on the spot, and losing her job that night meant losing Ruth's medicine the next day. So Naomi did the one thing she would curse herself for forever. She swallowed, pushed the fear down into the bottom of her apron pocket beside the phone, and lied to herself with every explanation she could find. Ruth must have pressed the wrong button. Eli must have been playing with the phone. There were only 2 hours left until the shift ended. She would call back the moment she stepped outside the gate. Those 2 hours were the longest and cheapest hours of her life, traded for one night's wages and paid for with a final goodbye. By the time she ran home, dawn had just begun to break. The door was unlocked. The neighbors were already there. Ruth lay peacefully on the bed as though she were sleeping, without a trace of pain on her face, only one hand still resting on Eli's hair as he slept beside her. The boy was too young to understand. Still half asleep, he only told Naomi that Ruth had been coughing during the night, that she had asked him to call his sister, but his sister hadn't answered, and then Ruth had held him, stroked his head, and told him a message he had memorized like a nursery rhyme. She said to tell you, "Don't cry, and don't blame yourself. You were the best thing I ever found along the road. Now I'm leaving this little bean with you. Raise him for me, and teach him what I taught you." Naomi had fallen to her knees beside that bed, pressed her forehead against the cold hand of the only woman in the world who had ever called her daughter, and found herself unable to cry aloud. From that morning onward, she never silenced her phone again. She never allowed herself to miss another call in her life, and whenever anyone asked about her family, she only fell silent and touched the ash-gray cardigan button. Ruth was buried on a windy day, at a funeral that was poor yet strangely crowded. Unknown faces came from everywhere and stood quietly beside the grave. A middle-aged man wept like a child and said that without the bowl of soup Ruth had given him years before, he wouldn't have survived that winter. Naomi stood there holding Eli's hand, and suddenly understood that she had never known the full truth about her foster mother, that the seeds Ruth had scattered into the wind had traveled much farther than Naomi had ever imagined, reaching places she couldn't even picture. What she could imagine even less was that one of those seeds, planted a very long time ago, had fallen upon the very ground toward which fate was now leading her, and that Ruth's simple name would soon be so spoken in a place no one could have expected. That weekend afternoon, while the children at the lighthouse home were taking their naps, and the brick courtyard held only the sound of wind moving through the oak branches, a car stopped outside the gate. This time there was only one car, no convoy, no guards, and the man who stepped out no longer carried himself like someone who had come to drive another person into a corner. Naomi was hanging the last of the small blankets on the wire behind the house when she heard the elderly woman in the cardigan drop an aluminum basin. She turned and saw Elliot Vance standing there across the courtyard from her, empty-handed, his eyes hollowed by sleepless nights, and for one long heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then he spoke first, and his own voice sounded strange even to him. "I didn't come to ask about the watch. I came because I saw the original recording from that night, the complete one, and I know who opened the safe." He looked directly at her and waited for some reaction, a flicker of relief, a tear at finally being cleared, anything at all. But Naomi's face only shifted slightly. like the surface of water disturbed by a stone, then became still again. And that stillness told Elliot more than any confession could have. She had known from the beginning. She had always known. He took one step closer, and the question broke out of him, carrying the weight of every sleepless night that had passed. You saw him. You were standing at the corner of that hallway. You had the truth in your hands, the truth that could have cleared your name with one sentence. So why didn't you say anything when I stood in this courtyard and humiliated you in front of the children? Why did you let an entire estate call you a thief? Why did you carry that accusation across half the city without speaking a single word? Naomi slowly folded the small blanket in her hands and placed it on the edge of the basket, her movements so calm they felt almost cruel to the man waiting for an answer. Then she raised her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was no louder than the wind, but every word fell onto the brick courtyard with the weight of stone. Mr. Vance, you live in a world where your word becomes law. You say one thing and people run. You nod once and doors open. Perhaps that is why you can't imagine the world of people like me. In that world, we have no property, no connections, no lawyers. We have only one thing to offer, our word, and that kind of wealth, sir, buys nothing, because no one believes it. She looked at him, her gray eyes weary but unwavering. Think about it. A woman who cleans at night stands up and says that Mr. Vance's right-hand man, the most powerful person in the house after you, was the one who opened your safe. Who would believe her? Would you have believed me? You who never once asked my name in 3 years. You who saw one piece of footage and were ready to believe I was a thief without a second of hesitation. Would your security team have believed me? The men paid by the very person I was accusing. Would the police have believed me when my record says I grew up moving through temporary homes while his is clean as snow? My words wouldn't have brought him down. They would have changed only one thing. They would have turned the anger of a man who had every possible way to destroy what little remained of my life directly toward me. And what remains of my life, Mr. Vance, no longer belongs to me. It is sleeping in the room at the end of that hallway. Elliot stood motionless, every sentence piercing some place behind his breastbone like a needle, because he knew she was right in every word. He himself was living proof of everything she had said. He had taken the footage and believed it immediately without a moment's doubt. He had stood in this very courtyard and thrown words at her that he now wished he could burn out of existence. The entire system he had built, the whole world he ruled, had been designed to believe the powerful and crush the weak, and she had understood that long before he ever did, understood it so completely that she hadn't even bothered to try. I was wrong, he said. 2 words Elliot Vance had never fully spoken to anyone throughout his adult life. I was wrong about you, and I didn't come here to ask for your forgiveness. I know I haven't earned that right. I came to tell you that the man responsible will pay, and you won't have to fear anything he holds over you anymore. I know about the application, Naomi. I know everything, and I swear on anything you choose that no one will touch that boy. At those words, the calm layer of ice across Naomi's face cracked for the first time. Not because her name had been cleared, but because Eli's name had been protected in someone else's promise, a burden she had carried alone for far too long. Her shoulders trembled once, very slightly. She turned her face away to hide her eyes, looking toward the window covered with silver paper stars, and when she spoke again, her voice softened for the first time during the entire confrontation. Don't swear to me, sir. I don't need your oath. I was raised by a woman who never swore anything. She simply acted quietly, opening her door all her life to people the rest of the world had shut out. She taught me that kindness doesn't need an audience and a promise doesn't need to be loud. Everything I have done, I have only been trying to live in a way worthy of her, of my foster mother, Ruth. She spoke the name gently, like placing a flower on a grave, and she didn't notice that behind her, the most powerful man in Baltimore had gone still, as though an invisible hand had seized his shoulder. The color drained from his face, and somewhere at the deepest bottom of 30 years of memory, something had been disturbed and set trembling. Ruth, he repeated silently. It couldn't be. That name. Why did it have to be that name? Elliot couldn't remember how he said goodbye, couldn't remember how he crossed the brick courtyard and returned to his car. He only knew that when his hand settled on the steering wheel, it was trembling. Something that had never happened even during the deadliest nights in the underworld he ruled. And throughout the drive home, that simple name echoed inside his head, with every sweep of the windshield wipers. Ruth, a woman who had spent her life opening her door to people the rest of the world had shut out. It couldn't be. There were countless women named Ruth, he told himself, but some memories recognized one another without needing complete proof, like an old scent, like the sound of a familiar hinge. When he reached the estate, he didn't go to his study. He went down to the basement storage room, where boxes of old belongings had followed him through every move, boxes he had never once dared to open, and inside a worn cardboard carton sealed with aging tape, beneath notebooks and picture frames lying face down, he found it, a rusted tin box printed with faded roses, the only keepsake that remained of his mother. He sat down on the cold concrete floor like a child, lifted the lid, and 30 years came rushing out without permission. Inside was a black and white photograph of a thin woman holding her young son outside an apartment block. There was also a yellowed dismissal notice bearing the seal of a textile mill, every crease of which he knew by heart, and memory came alive with the sharpness of a blade. He remembered his mother, a widowed woman who worked at the mill, her hands so calloused that even when she stroked her son's hair, her touch felt rough. One winter day, she came home with her face gray and bloodless. A valuable spool of thread had gone missing from the storeroom, and someone needed a name to blame. So they chose the easiest one, the widow with no husband to defend her, no influential family, no money to purchase even a single word in her defense. She had stood in the middle of the mill and sworn before heaven that she hadn't taken it. And among the hundreds of people there, people who had shared lunch with her for years, not one stepped forward to speak for her. Because the word of a poor woman, exactly as Naomi had said in the courtyard that afternoon, was a kind of wealth that couldn't buy anything. He and his mother lost her job, then lost their home. He remembered nights spent sleeping beneath one porch after another, then under stairwells. Remembered hunger twisting his stomach into knots, and most of all, he remembered that first snowy night of the season, when mother and son stood shivering on the porch of a small house glowing with yellow light. His mother was too exhausted even to knock, and the door opened on its own. A woman appeared within the frame of light. She didn't ask their names. She didn't ask for papers. She didn't ask how they had fallen so far. She only looked at them for a moment, opened the door wider, and spoke the words that the starving boy Elliot had carved into his very bones. "Come inside. The soup is still warm." Elliot sat motionless beneath the basement light, the photograph trembling in his hand, because those words, exactly those words, were the ones he had heard Naomi repeat that afternoon, in the voice of a daughter speaking about her mother. They had stayed in that house for nearly an entire winter. He remembered the woman mending his clothes beneath the lamp, remembered her pressing a little travel money and the address of a job in another city into his mother's hand when they finally left, remembered his mother crying as she asked how she could ever repay her, and the woman only smiled as she threaded her needle and said, "Don't repay me. Someday, when you find someone standing on your own porch, open the door. That will be repayment enough. Kindness is only a seed carried by the wind." He had never known her name. His mother had only called her their savior, and then the struggle to survive had swept them away. His mother died young from years of exhaustion before he had truly grown, and that orphan boy had built his life around one private vow: never be poor again, never let anyone trample him again, never trust anyone again. He had climbed upward using every cruelty he had learned at the bottom, built an empire on the principle of doubting everyone, and until that very afternoon, he had believed it was the only way to survive. It might not have been her his reason fought back one final time. Ruth was a common name. Surely kindness wasn't that rare in the world. But then he remembered Naomi's story about the funeral, poor yet strangely crowded, the unfamiliar faces who had come from everywhere, the middle-aged man who wept and said that without Ruth's bowl of soup, he wouldn't have survived the winter. And Elliot understood that whatever the odds might be, the nature of the truth remained unchanged. That woman had scattered hundreds of seeds throughout her life. He and his mother had been only one of them, a seed she had planted and forgotten, just as she had forgotten all the others. But the seed itself hadn't forgotten. It had merely lain dormant for 30 years beneath the frozen surface of a heart, waiting for the right words to break open. And what broke open with it was what finally made Elliot lower his head into both hands in the cold basement. It wasn't the strange coincidence of fate. It was a naked truth that looked straight into him and left him nowhere to hide. 30 years ago, people with power had looked at a poor woman and immediately seen a convenient thief. They had destroyed his mother not with evidence, but with prejudice. He had hated them his entire life. He had sworn to climb high enough that no one could ever do the same thing to him again. Yet only the week before, holding a carefully edited recording, he had looked at a poor woman, with her head bowed, and condemned her without a second of hesitation. He had stood in a courtyard full of children and thrown at the daughter of his own savior the very words those people had once thrown at his mother. He had climbed so high, only to become the exact kind of man who had destroyed her. Elliot remained in the basement for a very long time, until his hands finally stopped trembling, and when he stood, returned the tin box to its place, and closed the carton, his cold, watercolored eyes had frozen again, but in an entirely different way. A debt 30 years old, added to a debt 1 week old, would be repaid. He would repay it down to the last cent, beginning with the man who had arranged all of this. But on the other side of the city, in an apartment overlooking the harbor, Sasha Kroll had just set down his phone after receiving a warning, and he understood that the game had reached the point where he could no longer afford to move slowly. The warning call to Sasha came from an unnamed number, and its entire message was contained in a single sentence. The boss sent someone to retrieve the recording from the storage cluster near the harbor. Sasha Kroll sat for a long time beside the window, looking out at the dark cranes silhouetted against the night sky. He didn't smash anything or curse. No one who survived long in this world wasted strength on emotion. He merely recalculated the board with cold precision. That backup storage cluster was the only thing beyond his reach, a weakness he had always known about, but had gambled that no one else still remembered. Now that gamble had failed, which meant Elliot had seen everything, knew who had stood before the safe, and understood that the watch hadn't been stolen for money. With a man like Elliot Vance, the distance between knowledge and action was measured only in days. So Sasha did the only thing a gambler could do after his cards had been exposed. He moved all his pieces at once. That very night, secret meetings took place in the hidden corners of the city, in the back room of a tavern near the docks, on a bench inside a refrigerated warehouse. Sasha met with them one by one. The men he had quietly cultivated through all the years he had spent beneath Elliot's shadow. The manager of the Southern gambling house who still resented having his share reduced the previous season. The man responsible for the night shipments whom Elliot had once forced to kneel before his own subordinates. And several hungry young men who believed the boss had grown old through caution. Into each man's ear, Sasha poured a carefully measured dose of poison, saying that Elliot had lost his judgment over a servant, that he was neglecting the entire organization to clear the name of a cleaning woman, that a man who allowed mercy to guide him would eventually lead them all over a cliff, and that the changing times were opening a door for anyone brave enough to step through it. But Sasha had more than that move prepared. Inside his private safe, he kept a set of copied documents, the file from the lighthouse home containing Naomi Hartley's false declarations, and during the final meeting of the night, he placed those papers on the table before his conspirators, tapped one finger against them, and spoke in the voice of a man displaying a loaded gun. This is the servant's bridle, and it is Elliot's bridle as well. He wants to play the hero and clear her name, then let him. All it takes is one envelope delivered to the right place, and the girl will lose everything. The boy will be taken away. Think about how that woman will look at her savior when she learns that her entire life was burned down because he reopened this matter. Elliot Vance can stop a bullet, but he can't endure becoming the reason a child loses his home. That is his new weakness, and that is exactly where we will strike. Meanwhile, Elliot wasn't sitting idle at the estate. Over the following days, he made his own moves, quietly calling back the people he believed were still loyal, quietly transferring Naomi's original file to the safest place he possessed, quietly ordering Pruitt to place men around the lighthouse home day and night without letting her know. It was during those days of setting the net that Pruitt brought him news that made the ground beneath his feet, already cracked since that night in the basement, split open along another deep line. "Sir," the man said, his voice lower than usual, "someone inside the house is feeding information to Kroll, and it isn't anyone insignificant." Elliot raised his eyes, and Pruitt laid out the evidence layer by layer. The order to retrieve the harbor recording. Kroll knew about it within an hour after you authorized it. You never announced that order. You only spoke it aloud in this room to a handful of people. Then, there was your travel schedule last week. You changed the time twice at the last moment, yet Kroll's men still reached the correct route ahead of you. And the transfer of Miss Hartley's file happened only the day before yesterday, but by last night, someone on their side was already making inquiries about its new location. Elliot sat motionless behind his desk, his fingers interlaced, while the short list of people allowed inside this room when he gave those verbal orders appeared automatically inside his mind, one face after another, faces that had followed him for more than a decade, one belonging to a man who had once taken a bullet for him, another to a man whose daughter's wedding Elliot had attended, another to the person entrusted with keys to rooms even Sasha wasn't permitted to approach. Not one name on that list was allowed to betray him, and yet one of them was doing exactly that. He suddenly understood the cruelty in Sasha's move. Sasha didn't need to defeat him with guns or bloodshed. He only needed to plant inside Elliot the one poison Elliot had always been most skilled at feeding himself: suspicion. From that day forward, every order Elliot gave would force him to wonder where it would travel. Every face that bowed to him each morning would make him question what lay behind it. The empire he had built upon the principle of trusting no one was now being eaten from within by that very principle. Pruitt asked quietly, "How do you want me to handle it? Narrow the list and test them one by one?" Elliot remained silent for a long time, his eyes looking through the window toward the city lights, somewhere among them a room decorated with silver paper stars, and a woman still knitting an unfinished scarf. People who had no idea they had become pieces on a board about to be covered in blood. Then he spoke, slowly and coldly. "Don't test anyone. That would warn the snake. Let the traitor continue believing they're invisible. From now on, every true order will be spoken only to myself. Everything I say aloud inside this room will be bait." Pruitt nodded and withdrew, leaving Elliot alone with the most bitter discovery of the past several days, that in the world he ruled, the boundary between loyalty and betrayal had never depended upon distance, and the person he trusted most might, in the end, be the very person he should fear most. The trap Elliot set inside his study took only a few days to close. He told his inner circle that Naomi's original file would be transferred to a notary's safe on Charles Street on Thursday evening. But each person heard one slightly different detail, a different time, a different address, like marked pieces of bait assigned to separate fish. And on that Thursday night, when Pruitt's men caught a stranger creeping around the exact false address Elliot had shared with only one person, he didn't need a confession to know where every road led, because that address had been spoken into only one pair of ears. Rourke's, the head of the estate's security team, the man who had followed Elliot since the days when he hadn't owned a decent car, the man who had stood inside the study on the night the safe was opened and personally handed him the edited recording. Now Elliot understood why that footage had been so perfect. The following night, the underground council was summoned in the manner reserved only for matters of life and death. At an abandoned warehouse in the old harbor district, black cars slid one after another through the iron gates, and beneath the sickly yellow light of the bulbs hanging from the ceiling, every powerful face in the organization took its place around the single long table. Sasha Kroll sat at the far end, wearing the calm expression he had practiced beforehand. He had come because refusing would have been the same as confessing, and he still believed he had one final piece left to play. Elliot entered last, without the bodyguards who usually flanked him, alone with only a slim leather case in his hand, and that very solitude silenced the entire warehouse. He didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, set down the case, and began in a voice as calm as though he were reading an official record. "You know our law. It existed before me, and will remain after me. A man who steals from the family loses his hand. A man who betrays the family loses his name. Tonight, we are here to enforce that law." He switched on a small projector, and across the stained wall of the warehouse, the original footage appeared before dozens of watching eyes. Sasha Kroll walked toward the painting, entered the code, opened the safe, removed the watch, photographed its back from every angle, then looked directly into the camera with the same calm gaze that, enlarged upon the wall, now resembled nothing less than a confession. Chairs scraped sharply around the table, faces turned toward the far end, but Elliot hadn't finished. From the leather case, he removed photographs of the secret meetings held at the Harbor Tavern, and inside the refrigerated warehouse, every conspirator's face captured clearly through the lenses of Pruitt's men. Then he placed on the table the recording of the discussion about sending the envelope to the right place and using the servant's bridle. Each layer of evidence struck the wooden surface like another hammer blow. Finally, he turned toward the right corner of the table, where Rourke sat with his face growing paler by the second, and Elliot spoke only one sentence. The Charles Street address on Thursday night. I told only one person. The warehouse erupted in a single instant. Rourke sprang to his feet, knocking over his chair, his hand reaching for his belt, but two of Pruitt's men had already closed in behind him. The struggle was brief and desperate. The table shifted. One of the hanging bulbs swung violently and threw wild shadows across the room. Then Rourke was forced back into his chair and held there. At the far end of the table, Sasha had also risen, but he didn't try to run. Instead, he played his final card, his voice carrying through the warehouse. Look at him. Look at what he is dragging the entire family into chaos for. A cleaning woman. I possess the thing that will destroy that woman and the home she cares about. Elliot Vance, if you move against me, by morning the envelope will be on the desk of the people who need to receive it. You might restore her honor, but you will be the reason her entire life burns to the ground. Everyone around the table held their breath, waiting for the man at the head to falter. But Elliot only walked slowly along the length of the table, each step echoing against the concrete floor, until he stopped so close to Sasha that the man had to tilt his head back to look at him. Then Elliot spoke in a voice no louder than before, yet every person inside the warehouse heard each word clearly. What envelope, Sasha? The copied file inside the private safe in your harbor apartment. The safe my men opened on the very night you were busy pouring poison into the ears of everyone seated around this table. You held other people's reins for so long that you forgot one thing. A rein is still only a rope, and every rope has two ends. Elliot drew the copied papers from inside his coat, raised them so everyone could see, then let them fall into the burning oil drum in the corner of the warehouse. The flames surged upward and swallowed Sasha's final weapon whole, and in that same firelight, something visible broke within the man's posture. Elliot returned to the head of the table and delivered the sentence, his voice driving every word into the wood like a nail. Sasha Kroll. From this moment forward, you no longer have a name within this family. Every territory, every account, and every privilege is revoked. You will surrender the watch here, delete every image, and leave this city before sunrise. I'm sparing your life not because I've become merciful, but because I have just relearned something taught by a person better than all of us combined, that the only thing of value a man can keep until the end of his life is the way he treats someone already lying beneath his feet. As for those seated here who allowed themselves to be seduced by his words, I am giving you one night to come to me willingly. After tonight, don't blame the law. Sasha placed the antique watch on the wooden table. The small object that had begun everything gleamed beneath the yellow light. He looked at Elliot one final time with the eyes of a gambler who had lost everything, then walked between two silent rows of chairs toward the door, his shadow swallowed by the darkness of the harbor. Elliot lifted the watch, felt its familiar weight settle into his palm, and turned it over to look at the row of symbols, still engraved there like a question his father had left behind without an answer. But tonight, he no longer thought about them. The justice of the underworld had finished its part. What remained lay beyond every law he had ever known. A falsely accused woman still had to have her name cleared before the people who mattered. A debt 30 years old still had to be repaid, and a promise sealed with two little fingers about a sandcastle was still waiting inside a room covered with silver paper stars on the other side of the city. The morning after the night at the warehouse, every member of the estate staff was summoned to the grand hall, from the kitchen crew to the gardeners, from the newly reorganized security team to the hourly helpers. They stood in rows beneath the high vaulted ceiling, with the unease of people accustomed to receiving bad news, because in all those years the master of the house had never called everyone into the hall to announce anything joyful. Elliot stepped forward, but he didn't stand on the raised staircase as he usually did. He stood on the same level as they did, in the middle of the hall, and spoke without wasting words. Over the past several days, an accusation has spread through this house against Miss Naomi Hartley, claiming that she stole the watch from the safe in my study. Today I am standing here to tell all of you that accusation was false. The person who opened the safe has been exposed with complete evidence and has been dealt with according to the law. As for Miss Hartley—" He paused for a moment, and those standing nearest swore they heard the master's voice soften slightly. "Miss Hartley is innocent, more innocent than all of us put together. She endured a false accusation without a single word of resentment, and the only person in this house who should be ashamed of what happened is me. Anyone who repeats even half a sentence of the old accusation should understand that they no longer have a place here." The crowd dispersed amid astonished whispers, and when the hall had emptied, Elliot realized that Mrs. Doyle was still standing exactly where she had been, her hands clasped before her apron and gripping each other until the knuckles turned white, her reddened eyes fixed on him. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice trembling, "may I have a few minutes? There is something I must tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." In her familiar kitchen, beside 2 untouched cups of tea, Margie Doyle finally released the burden that had weighed upon her chest throughout the past several days. "Do you remember the day you called me upstairs and asked about the girl? There was a moment when I nearly told you something more, then stopped. Did you notice?" Elliot nodded faintly. "I noticed." She gave a sad smile. "I truly am getting old. I can't even hide things properly anymore." Then she began to explain, slowly, like someone pulling thorns one by one from the palm of her hand, that she had never known anything for certain, because if she had, not even the threat of heaven itself could have kept her silent. But she had suspicions, scattered fragments without a beginning or an end. Several weeks before that night, she had seen Mr. Kroll standing alone in the corridor outside the study very late at night, without the lights on. When she spoke to him, he said he was checking security. But what reason would someone checking security have to stand motionless in the darkness, staring at a painting on the wall? On another occasion, she had overheard him asking Rourke about the cleaning schedule for the private corridor, asking in detail about the exact time every night. By themselves, those fragments meant nothing. She had scolded herself for becoming suspicious and foolish with age, but when the safe was opened and every finger pointed toward Naomi, those pieces suddenly joined together inside her mind and formed something that kept her awake at night. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Elliot asked quietly, without accusation, only weariness. Margie looked down at her hands, and her voice grew as faint as ash. "Because 2 days before you called me upstairs, Mr. Kroll came into this kitchen and sat in the exact place where you are sitting now. He praised my stew, and then, in the middle of the conversation, he mentioned my grandson, who works loading cargo at the docks. He knew the exact crew, the exact shift, even the name of my grandson's little daughter. Then he smiled and said there had been many accidents at the harbor lately, and that an old woman like me should concern herself only with kitchen matters. That was enough, Mr. Vance. People like me understand that language." I stayed silent. I chose my grandson and abandoned that girl. I was a coward. For the past month, I have prayed every night for forgiveness, but I haven't dared look her in the eyes whenever she comes by. She began to cry, the tears of an elderly woman falling slowly and heavily, and Elliot remained silent for a long time, because he suddenly saw before him not a housekeeper who had failed, but the final piece of the same terrible picture. Naomi had remained silent for a child. Margie had remained silent for a grandson. No one had defended his mother all those years ago because everyone had been afraid. Evil in every age had never needed many weapons. It only needed to seize the right loved one belonging to each decent person, and the whole world would silence itself. Elliot reached across the table and placed his hand over her wrinkled one. "You weren't a coward," he said slowly and clearly. "You were a grandmother. The person who should be ashamed is the man who forced decent people to choose. He is finished. Your grandson is safe. And from this day forward, no one in this house will ever be forced to make that kind of choice again." Over the days that followed, Elliot completed the work he considered more important than anything that had happened in the warehouse. He brought in a reputable law firm, not the lawyers who exploited loopholes for the underworld, but attorneys who specialized in families and children. Naomi's entire case was reopened from the beginning and corrected properly. The legal process for granting her guardianship of Eli, which Ruth had never been able to complete, was formally set in motion. The expenses and sponsorship arrangements were handled quietly. A stable residential address was prepared and waiting for the day she needed it. The false statements from the old application were replaced with the truth, and now that truth was strong enough to stand upright in full daylight, leaving no weakness for any anonymous envelope to exploit. When the elderly attorney finally closed the completed file, he told Elliot that everything had been finished on the legal side and that only Miss Hartley's signature remained. Elliot stood beside the study window, looking toward the edge of the city, where the red brick building stood with its warmly glowing windows. His father's watch rested inside the breast pocket of his coat, ticking steadily beside his heart, and he knew that every road he had traveled during the past several days had now led to one final task, the most important one of all, a debt that had to be repaid by his own hands, in the place where a promise sealed with 2 little fingers was still waiting. That afternoon, the familiar car stopped once again outside the gates of the lighthouse home, but this time Elliot didn't come empty-handed. He carried a blue folder and was accompanied by an elderly silver-haired attorney, and the person who opened the gate for him was the woman in the cardigan herself. She studied him for a long moment, with the eyes of someone who had already heard the whole story, then said only, "She's in the backyard with the boy. Go to her yourself. This gate has never been closed to anyone who comes with a sincere heart." The backyard was flooded with afternoon sunlight. Naomi sat on the wooden steps, wrapping the scarf she had just finished knitting around Eli's neck to see how it fit. The boy spun in a circle, displaying it as proudly as though it were a medal, and when he saw Elliot approaching, he wasn't frightened as he had been the day the black cars stopped outside the gate. The children at the lighthouse home had already overheard the adults whispering that the man was good, only a little stern, so Eli waved, then ran off to find his red toy car, leaving the 2 adults alone with the courtyard and everything that needed to be said. Elliot sat down on the step an arm's length away from her, placed the blue folder between them, and spoke in the voice of a man who had practiced the sentence many times in the car, and still found it difficult now that the moment had come. "I've spoken with Dr. Hahn and the specialist board at the larger hospital about Eli. Don't worry, there isn't any bad news. It's quite the opposite. The doctors say his condition has reached a favorable stage, and the procedure he has been waiting for so long should be carried out soon. It won't happen overnight, but every week of delay adds another unnecessary risk. The only obstacle has never been medical. It has always been the cost, and beginning today, that is no longer a problem. The entire procedure, the best surgical team, the recovery room, the medication, and every follow-up appointment afterward have all been arranged. The paperwork is in this folder. It only needs the guardian's signature." Naomi stared at the blue folder without daring to touch it, as though the moment her fingers reached it, the dream would end. Her lips moved twice before any sound came out. "Why, sir? I never asked you for anything." Elliot had been waiting for that question. He looked directly into the gray eyes wavering with confusion. "You didn't ask, I know. People like you don't know how to ask. You only know how to give. That is why this time you aren't allowed to refuse, because this isn't a gift. It is the repayment of a debt." Then he told her, slowly, in the voice of someone opening a box that had been locked for 30 years, about a little boy who had once stood shivering beside his mother on the porch of a strange house during the first snow of winter, about a mother falsely accused of stealing at a textile mill, while hundreds of people refused to speak a single word in her defense, about the only door in the world that had opened on its own, and the woman standing in the light who had said, "Come inside. The soup is still warm." He told her about nearly an entire winter spent beneath that roof, about clothes mended under a lamp, and about the words, "Don't repay me. Someday, when you see someone standing on your porch, open the door. That will be repayment enough." Naomi listened, one hand slowly rising to cover her mouth, tears filling her eyes without falling, because she had recognized the house, the lamp, and those words before Elliot reached the end of the story. "That woman, Naomi, was your mother Ruth. I was one of the seeds she scattered into the wind and then forgot. I forgot where I had grown from. I climbed so high that I began to believe I had been born up there, until you stood in this courtyard and looked at me with the same eyes that no one at the mill had dared to use when they looked at my mother, and I realized I had become the thing I hated most." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and took out the antique watch, the small piece of metal that had passed through a father's hand, a locked safe, a conspiracy, and a night inside a warehouse, and now lay shining in the afternoon light across his palm. "This is the most precious thing I own," he said. "The entire city knows that. It is the only thing I have left of my father, and for years I kept it inside a safe behind 3 locks. I believed that protecting something precious meant locking it away. You taught me that it doesn't. You carry an old cardigan button inside a cloth bag, and you keep a promise to someone who is gone with your entire life. That is how a person truly protects something valuable." Then he took Naomi's roughened hand, gently placed the watch in her palm, and closed her fingers around it. "The person worthy of keeping this isn't the one who can pay the highest price, but the one who understands the value of things money can't buy, and in this entire city, I have found only one person like that." Naomi shook her head and tried to give it back. "I can't, sir. It belonged to your father." But Elliot kept her fingers closed around the watch and spoke the final words, his voice growing hoarse. "You have spent years quietly saving people when no one was watching, saving the children inside, saving that boy, and saving me as well, even though you never knew it. Mother Ruth asked you to raise her little bean for her, but she also left me with an instruction I haven't honored in 30 years. When someone is standing on your porch, open the door. So now, Naomi, it is my turn." At the far corner of the courtyard, Eli came running back with the red toy car in his hand, bewildered to find his superhero sister crying and smiling at the same time. The boy climbed onto the step and sat between the 2 adults, and that afternoon ended with the 3 of them sitting together in the sunlight, a blue folder now bearing every required signature, an antique watch ticking inside a roughened hand, and a little boy asking again and again whether the ocean was truly bigger than the yard outside the gate. The date of the surgery was set not long afterward, and everything was prepared down to the smallest detail. None of them could have known that, on the night before the operation, something unexpected was about to strike. On the evening before the surgery, the lighthouse home buzzed with the excitement of children preparing for a long journey. Everyone in the room contributed what they believed to be the most important advice in the world. One child reminded Eli to ask the doctor if he could see the stethoscope. Another lent him a lucky teddy bear. But the boy himself cared about only one thing. He placed the red toy car beside his pillow and made Naomi promise for the 100th time that once he was well again, they would begin saving for the day they would go see the ocean. Then he fell asleep peacefully, just as he did every night, his cheek resting against the new knitted scarf, completely unaware that in the hallway outside, the phone in Elliot's coat pocket had just begun to vibrate, and that the man's face was darkening with every sentence spoken at the other end. The caller was the elderly attorney, and the news he delivered struck like a bucket of ice water thrown into the warmth of the night. "Mr. Vance, the larger hospital has just announced that it is temporarily suspending the admission. The boy's financial sponsorship file has been flagged for verification. An anonymous complaint was submitted to the Assistance Fund a few days ago, accusing the original application of containing false information. Under procedure, the fund must freeze all support until the review is complete, and that review will take weeks. You understand what that means. Without financial confirmation, his surgery will be removed from tomorrow morning's schedule." Elliot stood motionless in the hallway lined with children's drawings, and every piece fell into place inside his mind within a single breath. A few days ago meant before the night at the warehouse. Sasha hadn't merely kept the copied file as leverage. He had carefully planted a timed explosive in the form of that anonymous complaint, ensuring that even if he fell, his final bite would still spread its poison. A man already driven from the city had somehow managed to reach his filthy hand into the sleep of a child. Anger rose inside Elliot with such cold force that he had to close his eyes for 1 second to contain it, because anger wouldn't save anyone tonight. Tonight, he needed something else. He turned and saw Naomi standing in the doorway of the children's room. She had understood enough from his face. Her gray eyes darkened, but she didn't panic. She only asked softly, "How much time do we have?" Elliot looked at his watch. "Until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." Then he spoke words he had never said to anyone in all his years as a powerful boss. "Don't be afraid, but I need you to trust me for one more night." That night became the longest since the rain-soaked night that had begun everything. Elliot sat inside the car parked outside the gates of the lighthouse home and turned it into a command center. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in Baltimore fought through an entire night without using a single weapon from the underworld. There were no threats, no envelopes, no phone calls carrying the scent of gunpowder, because he understood better than anyone that the smallest trace of coercion would stain the file forever and allow Sasha to win in the end. Instead, Elliot fought with the truth. The elderly attorney and his entire team were pulled from their beds. Every page of the newly legalized file was scanned and sent before dawn. The law office's confirmation, the new guardianship papers, and Naomi's voluntary statement explaining the false lines in the old application, and the circumstances behind them were all submitted. Elliot called and woke the director of the assistance fund. He didn't threaten anyone. He only said, "I am now the new sponsor of this case. From this moment forward, every financial question becomes my personal responsibility. I will place the full cost into escrow using clean funds verified by the bank before 6 o'clock in the morning. You may investigate that unsigned complaint for as long as you wish, but don't make a child pay the price for a piece of paper whose author didn't have the courage to sign their name." After a long silence at the other end, they asked him to give them a few hours. Naomi didn't sleep either, but she didn't pace the halls. She sat on the wooden steps in the backyard, the same place where Elliot had once placed the watch into her hand, and she knitted, one stitch after another beneath the porch light, because her hands had learned long ago that on nights when nothing else could be done, the least they could do was keep from trembling. Near dawn, Elliot came outside and sat beside her on the steps. Neither of them spoke. Two people carrying two old wounds sat quietly together, listening to the soft clicking of the knitting needles and the distant sound of the city turning in its sleep. Then Naomi spoke, barely above a whisper. "When I was young, whenever I waited for important news, Mother Ruth would say, 'Sit here and knit with me. No one has lost while the sky is still dark.'" Elliot looked toward the eastern sky as it slowly changed from black to gray and answered just as quietly, "She was right. No one has lost while the sky is still dark." A few minutes before 6, the phone rang and tore through the mist. The elderly attorney sounded breathless. "It's done. The escrow has been accepted. The fund removed the flag. The hospital has confirmed that the schedule remains unchanged. Bring the boy in at 7 o'clock. Those words made both people on the steps rise at once. Naomi clutched the ball of yarn and smiled, the smile breaking open with the first breath of relief after a very long night. The morning at the hospital unfolded like a warm dream. Eli woke up thrilled that he would get to ride in a large car. The nurses told him his knitted scarf was the most beautiful one on the entire floor. At the entrance to the procedure wing, he waved goodbye to Naomi and Elliot with the excitement of a passenger about to board a fascinating train, while Dr. Hahn held his hand beside him. Then, the doors closed, leaving the two adults with a row of waiting chairs and the longest hours of their lives. Naomi sat with her back straight, both hands gripping the antique watch in her lap as though holding a prayer. Elliot sat beside her, and at some point, neither of them knew who moved first. Her work-roughened hand and his ringed hand reached across the empty space between them and held on to each other. And so they waited, through the footsteps of nurses, through the voice over the loudspeaker calling someone else's name, through the sunlight slowly creeping across the tiled floor from the window at the end of the hallway, until at last, after what felt like 30 years added together, the doors to the procedure wing finally opened. The door opened, and the lead surgeon stepped out, pulling down his mask, and before he could say a single word, the smile in his eyes had already said everything. "The procedure went even more smoothly than we hoped," he said. "That little heart can now grow up alongside its young owner. In a few weeks, you'll be exhausted trying to keep up with him." In the waiting area, Naomi Hartley slowly rose to her feet, her legs trembling so badly that Elliot had to reach out and steady her. She bowed her head and thanked the doctor in a jumble of broken words that barely formed sentences, then turned toward Elliot and the woman who had remained standing through every storm of her life, the woman who hadn't shed a single tear when she was called a thief before a crowded courtyard, suddenly broke down and cried like a child. She cried freely, cried without restraint, cried for every time she had swallowed her tears and forced them back inside, and Elliot simply let her weep against his shoulder, one awkward hand gently patting her slender back, because he understood that these weren't tears of pain. They were the tears of someone finally setting down a burden after carrying it for far too long. The weeks that followed passed like a film moving slowly beneath warm sunlight. Eli recovered so quickly that he became a legend throughout the treatment ward. He demanded to go outside before he was allowed, bargaining with the nurses one day at a time. And then that morning finally came, the morning when everyone at the lighthouse home lined the porch and applauded as Eli, wearing his new sweater and the scarf his sister had knitted for him, crossed the sunlit courtyard on his own. At first, his steps were slow and careful. Then they grew faster, and finally became a short run straight into Naomi's open arms. The entire courtyard erupted in cheers. The children gathered around him, and the boy threw back his head and laughed, declaring loudly to the whole world, "I can run now. We can start saving to see the ocean, Sister Naomi. The ocean is much bigger than this yard, everyone." Elliot stood at the edge of the courtyard with one shoulder resting against the old oak tree, where he had once hidden on a rainy night to watch a thief, and as he looked at the scene before him, he felt his chest fill with something his entire fortune had never been able to purchase. By then, he came to the lighthouse home so often that the children had begun calling him Uncle Elliot without a second thought. One asked him to repair a toy car, another demanded that he sit and watch a drawing presentation, and the man who had once made the entire underworld tremble sat cross-legged on the brick floor, patiently holding a ball of yarn for a little girl learning to knit, so clumsy that Naomi had to turn away to hide her smile. That afternoon, after the children had gone inside for art class, and only the two adults remained seated on the familiar wooden steps, Naomi brought out the shoebox, the box that had followed her through the rainy night and the days of temporary lodging, now nearly empty because the toys had already reached the children they belonged to. "I want to show you something," she said. "This is where everything began. You once thought your watch was inside this box." They both laughed, and she began lifting out the small notes bearing the children's names, the ball of yarn, and the comic book, telling him which item had been meant for which child. But when she removed the final sheet of paper lining the bottom of the box and started folding it neatly, her fingers suddenly stopped. The cardboard beneath sounded hollow in a way ordinary cardboard shouldn't. A very narrow seam ran along one edge, as though the bottom had been made with two layers. Naomi frowned, slipped a fingernail gently into the gap, and the false bottom sprang loose, revealing a flat, hidden space underneath that she had never known existed, despite carrying the box with her for so long. Resting neatly inside was a yellowed envelope, and across the front was a slanting handwriting so familiar that it made her heart ache. The handwriting of the woman who had taught her how to form her first letters. "For my daughter. Read this when you feel strong enough." Naomi sat motionless. The shoebox had once belonged to Ruth. After the funeral, Naomi had taken it from her cupboard to hold the first small gifts she brought to Eli. She had carried this letter with her for an entire year without knowing it was there. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope, and Elliot quietly moved closer, reading with her the slanted lines whose ink had blurred in places. "My daughter, if you are reading these words, then I have already gone far away. Don't cry. I have lived a life fuller than I ever dared to dream. I have no wealth to leave you except the boy, and one thing I never had the chance to tell you. All my life, I opened my door to many people. I don't remember them all, but there is one person I have never forgotten. On a first snowy night many years ago, a mother and her son came to my door. That mother carried an injustice much like the ones I had witnessed throughout my own life, and her son, a little boy with the coldest and saddest watercolored eyes I had ever seen, stayed with me for nearly an entire winter. I often wondered what became of him. His name was, and at that exact line, time seemed to stop on the wooden steps. Naomi's head snapped up toward Elliot, and Elliot stared at the page, because the name at the end of the sentence, carefully written and in the slanted hand of a woman long gone, was a name that left them both speechless. The name in the letter was Elliot. His name was Elliot, the son of a textile worker who had been falsely accused, and beneath that, Ruth had written a few final lines in handwriting that had already begun to weaken. "I am telling you this story not so that you will go looking for that boy. The world is vast. I only want you to understand what I believed throughout my entire life, that kindness never disappears. It only changes hands. It leaves us and reaches someone else, travels a very long circle, sometimes as long as an entire lifetime, and then one day, when we need it most, it returns and knocks on our door in a form we never expected. So my daughter, keep opening doors, keep planting seeds. Don't be afraid of losing anything, the earth always remembers." And that day, on the wooden steps, The two of them sat in silence for a very long time beside the yellowed letter. Naomi looked at the man with the cold, watercolored eyes as he bowed his head over her mother's handwriting, while Elliot understood that throughout the past year, while he had doubted her, followed her, and accused her, the letter bearing his own name had been resting quietly beneath the false bottom of the shoebox she carried in her arms. Ruth's kindness had traveled a full circle across 30 years and returned to knock on the door at the exact moment both of them needed it most, wearing a form neither could ever have imagined. A few months later, Baltimore entered a new season, and anyone passing through the neighborhood at the edge of the city would have seen that the old red brick building had taken on a different appearance. The roof had been replaced. The porch stood straight again. The backyard now held a swing and a small vegetable garden planted by the children themselves, and the wooden sign for the lighthouse home had been freshly painted while preserving the same old words, a place where every child is welcome. Beneath it was a new and smaller line, the Ruth Sponsorship Fund, named for the woman who spent her life opening doors. Elliot didn't place his own name anywhere. He said his name already hung in enough places throughout the city, and that this place deserved to carry the name most worthy of it. His business was also beginning to change course, little by little, slowly but without turning back. The darker parts were gradually removed to make room for things that could stand upright in the daylight. When people asked why he had suddenly changed, he only answered, "I once believed I had built everything upon the principle of trusting no one, until a woman who had never possessed anything taught me that the strongest things in the world are built upon the opposite." Naomi didn't become someone else. She remained herself, still tying her hair neatly, still speaking softly, still knitting scarves every evening. The only difference was that she now stood straight in the daylight, with every ornament legally bearing her name as Eli's lawful guardian and the properly paid manager of the lighthouse home. The people who had once doubted her now bowed their heads in genuine respect when they greeted her, and every weekend, a familiar car could be seen stopping outside the gate. A tall man would step out carrying a box of pastries and be surrounded by the children before he could even reach the courtyard. Eli had fully recovered and had become the fastest runner in the neighborhood, and in his room, beside the old drawing of his superhero sister, there was now another picture. It showed 3 people holding hands before a vast stretch of blue water, and beneath it were the crooked words, "Our family went to see the ocean. The ocean really is huge, much bigger than the yard." The promise sealed with 2 little fingers had finally come true on an early summer morning, when the boy stood before the ocean for the first time in his life. He remained silent for a long while, then turned toward the 2 adults and said in the most solemn voice a child could manage, "When I grow up, I will open my door for other people too, just like Grandma Ruth, just like Sister Naomi, and just like Uncle Elliot. And on that beach, the largest sandcastle of all was built by 6 hands." The story ends here, but perhaps what it leaves behind does not, because this story reminds us of a simple truth that the busyness of life often makes us forget. Never judge a person by their position or the clothes they wear. The night shift cleaner who lowers her head and avoids your gaze may be carrying a heart larger than the mansion where she works. Dignity isn't found in wealth. It is found in the way we treat others when no one is watching, and kindness is never given in vain. It is a seed carried by the wind. The earth always remembers. Sometimes takes an entire lifetime to return, but it always returns. So if today you have the chance to open a door for someone, please don't hesitate. Perhaps 30 years from now, that very door will open for someone you love. And what about you? If you were Naomi, would you remain silent and endure a false accusation to protect someone you loved? Or would you speak even knowing that no one would believe you? And if you were Elliot, would you have the courage to recognize your mistake and turn back? Please write your answer in the comments. We sincerely want to hear what you feel in the deepest part of your heart. At what moment did this story touch you? Have you ever met a Ruth in your own life? Every comment you leave is a small light that helps stories of kindness travel farther. And if you believe today's story deserves to be shared, please press like. Send it to a friend who believes that people are greater than the worst thing others hastily accuse them of being, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the compelling and heartwarming stories we bring you every day. Finally, thank you for staying with Naomi, Elliot, and little Eli until this very moment. We wish you and your family abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.